Good evening and welcome to Everyday Use, a celebration of African American storytelling and quilting. My name is Dr. Kimberly Harper, and I'm the Associate Chair for the Department of English here at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, also known as A&T. Tonight's program is the kickoff event for community quilting and sewing program titled Everyday Use that my colleague Dr. Amy Schwarzat and I worked on this past summer. With grant funding from Creative Greensboro and additional funding from A&T's Department of English and support from A&T's University Galleries, which house the Maddie Reed African Heritage Collection and the H. Clinton Taylor Collection, along with community partners, the Fabric Store, French Connections, located in Pittsboro, North Carolina, Manny's Universal Cafe here in Greensboro, and New Africa of Greensboro. We are launching the Sankofa Sewing Club and Stitching Studio. The Stitching Studio is specifically for children ages 9 to 17 and was founded by Naima Kalfani and Jalea Abdul Razak last summer. They wanted to learn how to sew, and they had all these wonderful ideas, so here we are. I am a novice quilter and they are novice seamstresses. So they want to learn and we want to encourage them. In the club, children will learn how to quilt as well as sew, in addition to working on their public speaking skills and creating a private YouTube channel that's going to house crafting videos. So if you are a crafter, you know there are tons of videos out there on YouTube teaching other people how to craft. So these children want to encourage other children to get involved. And so that is the Stitching Studio. And this is the two of them this past summer. If you didn't have an opportunity to read Alice Walker's short story, Everyday Use, we're going to watch a film adaptation tonight in addition to the panel discussion. So, but I'd like to remind you all that this was filmed in 2003. And if it's kind of blurry, just so you know, but the quality is still there. It's just not what we're used to with our high definition televisions and things of that nature in 2020. But the essence of the story is there, and we will have the subtitles turned on so you can read along if you need to. After we watch the movie, our moderator, English professor, Dr. Elon Cooley, will engage our panelists in a robust conversation about the story, about quilting, about Black arts, and all things related. We will take questions from the panelists at the end of the program. So please make sure you type your questions into the Q&A box, and Ms. Williams or myself will present them to the panel at the end. And finally, before I get started, I want to introduce our wonderful panel to you all. We have Dr. Hope Jackson, who is the director of the MA in English and African American Literature program here at A&T. Dr. Jackson's research interests involve interpretive storytelling and narrative discourse analysis in rhetorical and literary genres. And her latest work is a book titled Brick by Brick, The Stories of Building the Black Beach Community of Ocean City, North Carolina. And it's currently under contract with Lexington Books. So you can look forward to that publication this summer. And if you are not following us on social media, Ms. Jade is going to drop those links into the chat, and you can follow us and keep up with the types of events that we're doing. The next person on our panelists I'm so delighted to have is Ms. Andrina Stoddard Coleman, and she's a native of Clinton, South Carolina, and presently resides in Greensboro, North Carolina, and works at Bennett College. She earned a Bachelor of Science in Economics from Benedict College and a Master of Public Health from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. As a self-taught quilter, she creates her work with expressions of spirituality, purpose, and empowerment. Her works have been exhibited at the African American Atelier here in Greensboro and the Delta Arts Center, and she was featured among 51 quilters in the International Quilt Exhibit, Conscience of the Human Spirit, The Life of Nelson Mandela. She is the owner of Drina's Dream Quintessential Quilts, and you can visit her online. We're going to drop the link to her website in the chat box as well. And last, but definitely not least, we have Dr. Faye Spencer-Mao, and she is an associate professor and former department chair of English here at North Carolina A&T. Dr. Mao's interests include 19th century African-American rhetoric and literature, the Black press, writing at the HBCU, feminism, composition pedagogy, and identity theory. She is also a lifelong sewer and quilter. So we're happy to have these three wonderful ladies here with us tonight on what is the last day of Women's History Month. So it's fitting that we have this program. I hope you all enjoyed that. It's a lot to unpack. So Dr. Cooley, I'm going to turn it over to you and our panelists.
All right, let me say good evening to everyone, and let me say that this particular story has touched the very fabric of my being. Here in this particular story, even though there's joy, there is a tinge of sadness. But I would like to address Dr. Jackson first and to say that there is a connectivity between the past and the present, and then the very distant past. Dr. Jackson, could you comment on that, please?
Yes, I can, Dr. Cooley. Thank you so much for posing your question to me. Um, this particular story has various meaning for me. Most people don't realize this, and Dr. Cooley is very humble about it. But I did not value African American folkloric traditions until I encountered a class of his when I was in the master's program here at A&T. And that course is African American folklore, which he continues to teach. And within that class is when I actually learned the value of storytelling. And from that, most people don't value the storytelling. A lot of scholars and researchers don't acknowledge it. They say that it's not a valid methodology of research. And so you go up against those types of Eurocentric ideals and standards. And so what I learned in Dr. Cooley's class, which speaks volumes and correlates so well with this story as well as the film that we just watched, is that there's value in meaning in stories, but also in traditions, in the oral traditions that are passed down. And while there were visual representations of that from the film, each of those carried and denoted some type of tradition in the family. There was craftsmanship that was involved. There was artistry when it came to making foods. Lemonade meant something so much different back then than it does today because you can go to the store and get the instant kind off of the shelf. But there was nothing like slicing a lemon and squeezing and getting the juice out of that lemon and then adding some type of sugar or sugar water to it. I mean, just the process itself was something that was very folkloric and it was very tradition. And so even that perspective itself, you can see that Dee, or Wanjaro as she calls herself, she doesn't value those traditions at all. And so when it comes to the past and the present, something that Toni Morrison is known for embodying and embody, well, when she was living, it's hard for me to use her in the past tense even now. But she had two ideals and tenets, which I myself try and incorporate in my own research and in my teaching. And that is that she believed in what she called moving the veil aside. And in the process of moving the veil aside, what she wanted us to do for those who were living in the present is to understand it from almost a Sankofa perspective. We have to begin to embrace and accept the recollection of others. And so while we live in the present, we can't negate or disrespect the past or those ancestors. And she, in essence, wanted us in the present as well as in the future to embrace somewhat of an ancestral memory. She wanted us to do things and always keep in mind that we have the spirits of our ancestors around us as we continue to matriculate in whatever it is that we do today and going forward. As far as the past, bringing the present and how it's affecting the future, it's something that is very unique in the African American traditions, be them stories, be them traditions such as making bread, yeast rolls in the mornings. I remember my great grandmother doing that as well. Quilting, sewing, crocheting, all of these things, they embody the diasporic perspective, but they were also things that wound up being more than just hobbies for the former enslaved individuals. And so those craftsmanships were passed down via generations to those who were the next descendants. And it's just something that I fully believe in today. And I'm going to tell a quick little quib. I know Dr. Cooley laughs at this every time I tell it, but when I gave my final presentation in his class, I actually brought some canned okra to class that my grandmother had made. And she taught me how to make it, but I didn't make that jar that night. But he ate the whole thing by himself. It was hilarious. So I knew then that he knew that I got it, that I understood it. And so it's something that continues to inform me and what I do today, both personally and professionally.
Let's say, I want to look, have you to maybe look a little bit closer to the mother's perspective in this particular story. Um, Even though I look at a piece of paper that says that it's told from her perspective, is the entire thing told from her perspective, the entire story?
I think so from, I'll say a non-signifying and a direct approach. If we look at it from an explicit standpoint, on the surface, it appears as if Mrs. Johnson is the one who is solely telling this story. But I also think that she's not just representing herself, but she's representing the ancestors that went before her. So from that standpoint, I think she is in essence embodying a Sankofa approach, or she is removing the veil and putting the veil to the side, as Morrison says. And she's not just speaking for herself, she's speaking for generations of Black women who have come before her. I think that she recognizes that her daughter is a critic. And she's a critic who I think she's surprised by the fact that this child that she gave birth to is criticizing her ways, everything that she stands for. But I think she, in the end of this story, reminds D, is what I'm going to call her, because I'm not going to call her Wayne Carroll. I'm just not. But when it comes to pointing out to D, it's as if she tells her in very implicit ways, you know, you haven't been gone that long. The roads haven't changed. The land itself has not changed. We're still the same people. Even though you reject us, you reject our values and our traditions, we in essence are the individuals who made you who you are today. And even when it comes to that, I think that Mrs. Johnson is someone who wants and seeks the love of her children. But I think ultimately this visit is a final visit, and everyone who's present knows that there's not going to be another visit from Dee. This is it. And I think in this moment, Mrs. Johnson knows that that's okay. As a mother, that's okay, that she has to let this child go and do whatever she needs to do.
But you know, that brings me then to Mrs. Coleman. You know, when Dee says that this particular quilt, you know, everyday usage. I want to stay with Dee for a second, Mrs. Coleman. Is Dee totally lost when she seems to have a concern for the artistic work of the quilt, even though she comes off as being a bad person? What can we say about the artistic creativity that Dee seems to appreciate?
Well, I think in this instance, Dee has found her roots somewhere. Uh, and now she wants to show them off to her friends and everyone else. See, look what I have. Look what the old folks made. Look what they did. I don't know if she actually appreciated what went into making that quilt, or what the value of that quilt is to individuals. She's looking at it um, more from a platonic type. You know, it's something I can show off. It was like the churn. You know, she's going to go home and probably put flowers in it or something, but not understanding what that meant to the lives of the people that she grew up with, that went before her. And that's the scary part about, um, as we look at the artifacts and the antiques and things that our families have, we really don't appreciate where they came from, how they originated, what it took to get them. You know, those scraps meant a lot to Maggie and her mom, because they can remember when it was put together, the clothes that it came from.
Yeah.
That's powerful, because that's a semblance of remembering, always commemorating the life of someone.
Yeah.
But I think that my girl Dee, and I'm not going to call her other name either. I don't think she got it. I think she was looking for decor.
Now, it is true, I think it has been stated that you also make quilts.
Yes.
When you make them, are you making them with two goals in mind, from an artistic standpoint or for a utilitarian purpose?
Well, it's depending on what day it is and how I'm feeling. All of my quilts are designed by me. They're all one of a kind. And I may start out making a lap quilt, and it turns out to be a king size quilt. I never know what it's going to be. Most of the quilts that I make, however, are wall hangings or lap quilts.
Yeah.
I make a few large quilts, mostly to kind of accent a bed or accent a sofa.
Yeah.
Or a table. But in making those quilts, I'm thinking about something. Something is inspiring me as I'm making that quilt. And usually I have music on, or I'm thinking about growing up, or I'm thinking about, you know, what tomorrow might bring. So the more I think, the larger the quilt gets.
Yeah.
And I was telling some folks last week, I said, I have a promise to myself. I do not start another quilt until I finish the one I'm working on.
Wow.
Because you can have a whole lot of stuff waiting to be finished. And if you're doing something from the spirit or from a creative sense, it's not something you just put down and say, I'll pick it up next month.
Yeah.
You continue with that spirit, with that creativity.
Where do you get your inspiration for these creative products?
Well, I could be riding down the street and see a sign or a billboard, or reading a magazine and seeing the colors. And that's why I like using the African prints, because I like the vibrancy of the pieces, the quilts of the fabric. I think it brings life to the quilt, and it's also something that is so unique. You're not going to see it somewhere else. Well, if you do, they worked hard to do it, because everything's one of a kind, and a lot of pieces that I make are made from scraps. So it's not like I go out and buy 6 yards of fabric and start making something. This is one of my pieces.
Yeah.
I just started out making. It was supposed to be placemats for a table, and it ended up being a wall quilt. So, yeah.
It is beautiful. Beautiful.
Thank you. And I also, in the story, they referenced the Lone Star quilt. My great grandmother, who is my continuing inspiration for quilting, made one that I have, and I don't know who made where the fabric came from, but this quilt has got to be close to 60 years old.
Yeah.
Because it was made back in the late 50s, early 60s, and it's hand quilted. So I use it when my grandchildren get sick or have a little fever. I put them under that quilt. It'll sweat any fever out. I mean, it's that heavy, and that's what quilts were used for. They were quite functional. While decorative, they were functional. So quilts were kind of a medicine for us.
Well, now, let me ask one other question, and then we'll get to Dr. Miles in just a minute. But now, so you're saying that you learned this craft from your grandmother, or from whom did you?
Well, I remember her because I remember her quilting, because she had a quilting frame, and we would sit under the frame, and when she pushed the needle through, we push it back up.
Yeah.
But I never really quilted with her. I mean, I was, when she passed, I was quite young, but I can remember her quilting, and she quilted mainly alone, which is what I do. I'm not a member of a guild or anything. I quilt alone.
Before I get to Dr. Mao, and let me go back to the host, Dr. Harper. If you see that I'm being a little bit long-winded, you can kind of prod me along. But now, let's go back to Mrs. Coleman for just one more thing. You remember about 20 years ago, there was a lot of quilting associated, with the AIDS pandemic. Did
Yes.
you participate in any of that?
No, I didn't. I started quilting maybe about 10, 12 years ago.
Yes. Oh, okay.
Yes.
All
So, and I just picked it up and just started doing it.
right. Okay. Let's go to Dr. Mao. You seem to be just overflowing there. You came from a tradition of quilters also.
I come from a tradition, I call them makers,
Yeah.
and it is primarily my mother. My mother taught me to sew, to knit, to crochet, to quilt. So all of those things she passed on. She had four girls and she made all of us learn something, but not everybody embraced it or found it, something they want to do. uh, I seem to like it. And as a matter of fact, and quilting has been one of the ways I've been making it through this pandemic. And in that sense, it's been a blessing that I've been able to get back, in a sense, to my mother. And I got all kinds of amens and ahas because the in the story, the quilts that Mama promised to Maggie were the quilts that Maggie participated in making.
Mhm.
So there is a knowledge and an experience that Maggie has that will allow her to appreciate um, all aspects of herself. At least I think so. Whereas Dee is objectifying them. In other words, she looks at them as artistic expressions. That's wonderful, but she doesn't seem to be interested in what the making means.
Yeah.
And one of the things I came across today is I was looking at things. Okay, how do I get my mind in this space? Because this is a short story I have used over the years, particularly in composition classes, and because I think there's so much in it. And I came across one of my old anthologies on feminist literary writers, and this one article is called "The Laying On of Hands," and it fit perfectly because Dr. Cooley, I'm a preacher's daughter. I'm from the deep South.
Mhm.
I had cousins down there around the G's Bend quilters, so I had the dirt road experiences with those women who were quilting by hand. I got to watch them quilt, and then my mother showed me, and my mother encouraged me learn how to do it on the machine. That Dee is so disparaging about, um, for the very reason that Dee's mother tells her they'll last longer.
Mhm.
So all of this is connected to my mother and the stories. And in this particular article, the woman's name is Jasmine Gibbons, and she talks about writers like Alice Walker and how they write these kinds of stories and we should look at what they're trying to get us to do in terms of connecting with our folk traditions and
Mhm.
practices as a way of having hands laid on you
Yeah.
from the church. So, I was like, well, it hit me. Because, those of us from the Black church tradition, the laying on of hands is when you imbue people and empower them, you gift them, you ordain them. And I see for Maggie that her mother is laying hands on her,
Yeah.
and saying, "You're the one who has the true power." Dee and um, Mr. Barber all talking about the cause, but what is the cause? What is the cause? If you tell me you can't find your way back home on these dirt roads, what are you really fighting for? And, you know, Dr. Coleman, Mrs. Coleman was talking about her grandmother's quilt. Every time I see a quilt or think about it, I think about being sick and my mother piling a quilt on me to help me sweat out the fever.
Mhm.
So the artistic expression has to be connected to the cultural practices if you want the power of the practice. And there's a power. Hanging it up doesn't give you the power. Using it every day gives you the power. And so this metaphor of the laying on of hands is about, you know, Gibbons talks about in this article how that is the thing that transmits knowledge, pride, tradition. Um, and so, in a way, your mother, your grandmother, your aunties, your cousins, by showing you how to do it, by your embracing it to use every day, they're constantly transmitting themselves. And she argues that for writers like Alice Walker, they write these kinds of stories because they're trying to find out who they are as Black women. So part of this is also, you know, embracing these traditions from our family and our mothers is something that gives us power. And you can't get the power from just hanging it on the wall. You got to use it every day to survive. And that's one of the reasons. So, what's more valuable, objectifying it on the wall or getting under it every day, having hands laid on you? Because that's what it's like. Over the pandemic, my mother died maybe 5 years ago. She lived with me. I had all these clothes, and I had to decide what I was going to do with her clothes. Was I going to donate them? I made a quilt. So my daughter has already told me that that's her heirloom. And I'm like, I don't know where you get that from. But by having that quilt with her clothes, every square, I remember that dress. She used that for church. It's a story. And when you lay it on you, my mother's laying hands on me. And therefore, I can never forget who I am
Yeah.
from the practice or from the object. So, did that answer your question?
It does, and you open up, you really open up an even larger can of worms, and I'll tell you what, because even though you use the term objectification, when we look at D, but then I go back to something that Mrs. Coleman said, that sometimes her artistic creations find themselves on a wall, and what then is the difference between a truly magnificent piece that is put on the wall uh, that is appreciated by most of the masses. And let's go back to that lady named Dee. Uh, she is objectifying, but can she not really appreciate what has been created? She may not know all of the steps that went into it. But what then is the difference? I want to go to Mrs. Coleman back to that. On the wall, just to enjoy it, as in the case of Dee, and then some of the things that you have put on the wall to continue to enjoy.
Well, I can think of one piece that I did. It was part of the Sojourns exhibition, and it focused on the assassination of African Americans. And it was it's probably a 30 by 30 piece, you know, small wall hanging. But on that piece, I have a photograph. I have included a photograph of a Black woman hanging from a tree, of the 4 little girls in Birmingham, Sam Cooke, Trayvon Martin, and Emmett Till side by side.
Wow.
So the quilts that I make are intended to provoke or bring about some sense of conversation, education, history.
Yes.
Some of my quilts have quotations like African proverbs or quotes from famous women and famous men. So while they're wall hangings, they have a message. And that's, you know, part of it. And some of them I just start doing and it ends up on a wall. But I think that people see different things when they see the quilts. That's the important thing to me. You know, it's hard now to buy the kind of cotton that my great grandmother bought to put in a quilt that will allow us to sweat out a fever.
Yeah.
They just don't sell that kind of material anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, a lot of what I do is more on a, I guess, a history, legacy, decorative mode than my great grandmother did. Yeah.
And as I
Dr.
see,
Cooley,
yes,
just so I can piggyback, I think the key word Mrs. Coleman said was intent.
yes,
What, you know, you make them with an intent. I don't know anyone who approaches a craft project, quilt, or without an intent.
mm-hmm.
And in the story, the mother clearly tells you what her intent is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's part of Maggie's inheritance as she starts her own family.
Yeah.
And that's what's important. And I think that in a way, Walker might be saying that, is it just okay? Or are you really finding your complete self if you can only appreciate it as art itself and not really see the intent of the makers and value the intent of the makers? So I just wanted to add that in. And Mrs. Coleman and anyone who makes and sews, you have an intent. Often
Yeah.
it is a thought or an idea, a person or a story that gives you the inspiration to want to start the project.
You know, I want to
And
go.
that's what makes a difference.
Let's go back to Dr. Jackson one more time. You know, Dr. Jackson, you seem to be uh, subjective in one statement. Well, we can't help from being subjective. But is Dee lost forever as far as her connection to with the family is concerned? Is she lost forever?
I think she was lost before she left.
Yeah.
I think if we look at the written version of the story, this is a woman who set her house on fire. The first home that they lived in, she set that house on fire. And in the story, it's very evident if you look at her behavior. If you look at her behavior, Walker describes her as being fascinated with the blaze. She's not interested in whether or not anyone got out. She doesn't yell fire. She doesn't yell for her mother to get out or her sister to get out. I believe that she intentionally set that fire. I think she was lost long before she left. And if we reread the story and look at it from a close reading perspective,
Yeah.
not only is she lost prior to leaving, but the church and her mother raised the funds to send her to Augusta to go to school. And so we know that if she remains there, that behavior is going to be repeated. There's some type of antagonism or jealousy that is taking place, that Dee resents who she is and who her family is. She has no desire at all to be a member of their family. She's not interested in her sister. She's not interested in her mother. She's not interested in the community, the church, nothing. What she's interested in is being beautiful. She almost embodies very Eurocentric ideals and perspectives. And so it's almost as if, I think what I wrote down in the notes that I had is that when we look at Dee, we see that the two sisters, and we see that Maggie is an introvert and that Dee is the extrovert, and that she in essence doesn't even fit the Johnsons, because Mrs. Johnson describes her as someone who has a quick tongue, someone who can look at anybody in the eye and say anything, and there's no hesitation at all in her nature. So it's as if she's really not a Johnson. It's almost as if she is someone who has come and invaded this space. I looked at her, and what I wrote is that Dee in essence represents the flames. So it kind of reminds me of Beloved from Toni Morrison, where you almost have a revisitation of a spirit, in essence, who has come into this space and she doesn't fit. So what do you do with her? And the answer in this particular case was that her mother and the church, they sent her away because they knew she would wind up killing someone.
Yeah, but let's stay on that point a little bit longer. Then is she not saying something about education? What then is the purpose of education if it is being viewed in a negative vein, or is it being viewed in a negative vein in this particular story?
I think she sees education as simply a rung on a ladder that can get her to her next position, her next whatever is her ideal sense of belonging. Her purpose is that she wants to belong and she wants to feel important. You have to keep in mind that these two women, Mrs. Johnson and Maggie, are educated, not just in the formal sense of an education. And so I think that she uses her education that is paid for on the suffering in the backs of the Black community that she is left and abandoned, in essence. She's using that as a rung on a ladder. And so she doesn't appreciate the traditions of the Black community at all, unless it helps to benefit her, unless she can profit off of it. And even in a sense that, going back to what Dr. Mao said, what is the purpose of the movement if you don't understand the individuals who can benefit from it? She could care less about that. For her, it's just a platform.
We didn't say anything about Wangero's husband, or, and it kind of reminded me of something that probably be, well, have you ever heard of a pig ear? We used to say a pig ear sandwich. When I look at, you've not heard of that, Dr.
I
Harper.
have not.
Yeah. But now,
No.
then, I see conflicts. I still see conflicts when we look at the past versus the future. Here, the husband, the boyfriend, uh, he's Muslim, and now look at, we've been used to eating pork, the pig, but what does that say then about religion, the past and the present? Can we say anything there in this area? I'm not. Should we leave it?
I think that we can, but I think that we have to look at his, based on what we're presented with, what Walker gives us. I think that we have to look at how he, in essence, embraces religion as if he's just throwing on a kente cloth for the day. It's not something that is meaningful or spiritual for him. It's just something that he can take it up as a part of the cause for, the movement and the importance and the purpose of the movement. There's nothing that he shares specifically about any types of scriptures or readings. He doesn't go into detail other than the very superficial perspective of, I don't eat pork. My name is Mr. Babar. And, even how he greets her. If you consider yourself a spiritual person and you are trying to teach someone about your spirituality, someone who's a true believer is going to be willing to be patient enough to explain that, because that's a part of the spiritual journey that you take. You look at yourself as a servant leader, and so you take on that leadership role and you're willing to educate. But that's not even what you can see in his reaction. He does it in a very condescending manner, as in, you're just as stupid as she said you were. So it takes on a completely different meaning from him. And I'm also disturbed by looking at the film as to how uncomfortable Maggie is in his presence. That is something that spoke volumes to me, because if we look at her rhetorical body language, she's very uncomfortable with him. When he looks at her, she immediately looks away. And so I think that there's something else there, as well, as if she suspects something about him that maybe the others don't. He kind of gives her a weird side eye sometimes. So I got to wondering about that as well. But it kind of shifts when we get inside the cabin, the house itself. He's looking more at her scars on her arms, but nonetheless, he in essence is judging and objectifying them. Definitely. So,
Let me stop at this juncture and ask if either of the three presenters have anything else that they would like to say at this point. I did want to, and this may be for another setting. I wanted to at least look at the wife eating what is forbidden, and she's saying that, listen, you may not eat pork, but I'm gonna let me have some. So, she's not completely, she hasn't completely discarded all of these traditions um, in one way of looking at it. But let me see if there's another statement coming from Mrs. Coleman or Dr. Miles before we open it up to others in the audience.
Well, Dr. Cooley, I have something to say. I think what Walker is trying to, I think there are so many things because, one of the things that stuck out to me about Mr. Barber, as Mama calls him, is that, there is such a thing as religion as performance. Because he says, Assalamu alaikum. And Mama says, well, yeah, there's some people down the road who raise cattle, and y'all coming out here with this kente cloth and these African prints. You're talking about your heritage. And perhaps Mama is referencing some real Africans who live down the road from her. But what is his response? I don't do all that cattle stuff. I don't believe in all of that. But then you sit down and you talk about you can't eat pork. So in a sense, neither one of them know what they believe in my view. They're performing, and they're performing not necessarily for their own people. There is such a thing as Black people performing for Black people, for Europeans, if you get what I mean.
Yes, yes.
And that's what I kind of see happening with both of them, especially when, Dee's parting statement is, you don't know your heritage. What is heritage? How do we express it? Do we express it by what we wear, what we eat, what we speak? Do we appreciate it and embrace it by how we live? And and I'm talking about living metaphorically.
Yeah.
So, not just where, but so I think we have to look at that. And again, it's a way of really kind of what kinds of ways should we be searching ourselves when we do these kinds of things?
Okay.
Is it so, you're talking about unclean, could you ask him, could he explain to you how pork is unclean? Could he? I don't know.
Mhm.
So, that's what I think about that. And I think Walker is asking us to look at that. What's performance and what's real?
Yes, yes, okay. Mrs. Coleman,
Well, I took away another, I agree with everything that's been said, but I also take away a sense that what will we leave our next generation?
Mm.
I mean, how will we be remembered? Um, I think now that since everything is such immediate gratification, you go to the store, you get it. Most folks don't know that milk comes from a cow. It doesn't come from Walmart. But what are we teaching our generations that will come after us? And what will we leave them with that is of us? Something tangible, something that they can understand what our struggles, what our victories, what our life was like. And that's one of the things that I have done. I've made a family quilt with pictures of all of my siblings, my parents, my grandparents, and of course my sister won't let me have it. But I said, now this gets passed from family to family
yes,
because you can always have a photograph, but this is something that was made with pure love, and it's something that we will pass on. And we must have something that we can give other than something that can be destroyed in a week or whatever, but something that is truly of us. to our next generation. And I think about that when I saw the churn, and the way Maggie was touching it. I said, that was love.
Yeah, yeah.
That was a lot. There was a lot of memories, a lot of pain, a lot of hard work, but also a lot of joy that was put into making that churn and using that churn. So what will we leave our next generation?
You know, a good article that can be written from this presentation um, is the morphology of the quilting tradition. Uh, what purposes are, are now in the forefront more? Have the purposes changed? Have the goals changed? Is it more artistic now than utilitarian? Um, but I think there a lot could be said. A lot of articles could be written on this. I did hear the healing qualities coming uh, uh, from Dr. Mao, and then you seconded that particular thing. Um, of course, before we open it up, Dr. Harper, to the vast audience, I want to put in my orders for quilt coming from Mrs. Coleman and Dr. Mao. So I know I'll be in the hundreds of dollars, but I don't want a lap quilt. I want one that I can just kind of, have those dreams or, the healing dreams or whatever. I want to be covered, as I say, covered in the blood or whatever. But so put all of that spirituality when you create one, or when it hits you. I do like that. I do like what you said, Mrs. Coleman. That people who create poetry, who create literature, who create music, sometimes they get a feeling, a spiritual feeling when they're riding along or when they think about the past or whatever, and then that light comes on and they'll create something that is worth not only hundreds of thousands, but millions. And in terms of the family, it could connect the family much more than what money can do for us. So, Dr. Harper, let me stop and allow you to get into the vast audience of people who are in the wings waiting to be heard.
Okay. We actually don't have any questions. I'm surprised. So if you're out there, people, drop some questions in the chat and we will pass them on to our panelists. I do have something I'd like to bring up, the use of African fabric, because it's so prominent now in a lot of the quilting that you see. But also just in the clothing, right? We see a resurgence of the use of this fabric. Do you all think it's because it's ubiquitous, right? And there's a connection. We feel good, but it's not made on the continent. I mean, there are some textile makers on the continent of Africa creating textiles, but these Dutch wax fabrics, what we call African print fabric, do not come from the continent often. So do you think there is some type of kismet connection that people feel and that's why they want to use it so much? Or, I mean, it's beautiful, out the gate, but why is it so popular? Do you guys have any ideas about that? Or why Walker made a point of talking about, well, dressing Wanjero, Miss D in the Kente?
Well, I'll start. One of the things, the fabric is constructed totally different than your basic fabric, your basic cottons that you wash it and it turns into another color, or it does not have the stay that you would want in a quilt or a wall hanging. I look for fabric that has durability because I'm gonna use a seam ripper a couple of times during this process, but also to be able to get the variety of colors. When I started quilting, I would go to Joann's, nothing against Joann's, and I would watch the women try to match up the color codes at the end of the bolts. Now, I've been sewing all my life, but I never really thought about that. I mean, they would actually go into a panic mode if those color codes did not match. But also that quilting is a multi-million-dollar business in this country.
Wow.
Mhm.
Women have, and men now, have gone out and bought these $5,000 sewing machines.
Wow.
They go to every quilt festival there is. They'll pay $20 a yard for fabric, and they'll spend 2 years making one quilt.
Wow.
All of my quilts are, with the exception of my t-shirt quilts, are hand quilted.
Mhm.
And that's to keep the tradition there.
Mhm.
Um, but they have these $30,000 machines that
Yeah.
machine quilt. I'm like, first of all, I don't have the space, and secondly, I don't plan to spend that kind of money because it is not a production for me.
Mhm.
Mhm.
It's a movement, a spirit for me.
Mhm.
Um, but
Not
I just
commercial.
love the African prints, and to find someone that sells them and doesn't have made in China on it. I'm good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think for me, I think it's popular for, I concur with Mrs. Coleman as well. It has something to do with the durability of the cotton, because the cotton fabric that's sold, and that's what I like to use. It's not like it was when my mother and my grandmothers were making quilts, because of the lack of durability. And I think it's also the saturation, not just the colors, but the saturation of colors. you know um, it doesn't fade quite so easily. And I think it's another way to appropriate culture. I mean, y'all, let's just face it. you know African American culture is all. I even found a site recently from a company in Florida that's selling Aboriginal cottons, traditional patterns. And so I've been looking at that. So, you know, I- um, I don't know what it is. I do think it's a fad. I do think it's another way of some people trying to claim something that they think they have, but they don't really understand it. Um, And then I think it just comes down to just being more interesting. The prints, the patterns are just more interesting and attractive. And I think that has to do with imagination, how people see the world. Um, and but I'm always looking at whether or not people really understand why are you wearing it? What are you wearing actually? Even when you wear African clothes, what is that style? Do you really understand what that is? And why are you doing it? So that's just my 2 cents.
Okay. Well, we have a couple of questions coming in. Um, we have, let's see, Jason DePolo. Dr. DePolo is asking, can the panelists please comment on everyday uses or quilting's relationship to African folkloric tradition of art for community's sake versus the Western Eurocentric tradition of art for art's sake?
Um, I'm going to start this way. I think that African American quilting traditions don't focus on one or the other. It goes it goes hand in hand. That utilitarian use does not have to be ugly, and it's never meant to be ugly because life is not ugly. So
Mhm.
why should I have to make a choice between having to wear a garment to work and then have being drab? And if you look, particularly in Senegal, the tradition of strip quilting, you will see in Senegal um, there's similar practices in their textiles. There you'll see costumes, pants, where and the other thing is, when you're poor, you make do with what you have.
Yeah.
So, but just because that's all you have, it doesn't mean it has to be ugly. And I would say that limited resources often push the artistic expression. And I think, because if you look at some of the quilts in G's Bend and some of the quilts I grew up in, and Mrs. Coleman was talking about the big industry and those big quilting machines, one of the fads I've seen is that a lot of these women here in North Carolina will make these beautiful quilt tops, and then they'll take them someplace that has this big fancy quilting machine, and you have to pay them to quilt it in some kind of pattern. And see, I grew up with hand quilting as well. I didn't know anything about that, and actually, I felt like it wasn't really a quilt if I didn't do some hand quilting. But there's something about creating out of necessity that I think brings the artist out of the most unlikely people. Uh, in my example, because I was born in Alabama, is G's Bend. Those women were quilting out of necessity, one of the poorest places in Alabama. And then you had Europeans come in and go, these women who sing in church, they've never been to school, they barely graduated high school. How did they put these patterns and colors together? Their quilts are not even straight, but yet they're hanging in the Smithsonian. And now they're selling for $2, $3, $5,000, $10,000 when they were just getting together in their houses and doing it. They were doing it out of necessity because they couldn't go to the store and buy a blanket.
Well, Dr.
They needed
Miles,
to be warm. So I think, I think it goes. I don't know if I get to the polls question or not, but I don't think that the artistic side and creativity and utilitarian needs have to be mutually exclusive, and I would argue that they're not mutually exclusive.
Okay. Okay. I think Brenna's got some questions she's pulling from the chat for us.
Yes. Let's see here. If I can scroll up. Amy Schwartzat says, I'm interested in the recycling aspect of quilts. Would you all speak a little bit more about that? And she loves the presentation.
Well,
Say the recycling?
yes.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say the recycling was, in my experience, was also out of necessity. You know, growing up in Alabama in the 60s, a lot of the textile arts, as we call them now, was out of necessity. We couldn't go to the store. We didn't have the money to buy material by the yard. Um, if you bought a dress, it got handed down, and then my mother would remake things. One of the earliest stories is my mother, they used to sell flour in white cotton bags down there in Alabama, and she would take those and make shirts for my brothers out of necessity. Again, it was necessity and poverty, and those things push people to be inventive. And for me, um, when you talk about the quilt I made for my mother's clothes, I was like, what do I want to do with these? Who do I want to give them to? Does anybody, maybe some of them were too worn, you know? And I just decided, it just came to me. I think it was a spiritual thing that this would be a way not only to preserve my mother's memory, but also to show her that I remember what she taught me. And so instead of giving the clothes away, I cut them up. And that was the practice that I was used to. That's what quilts were made from, scraps.
you know, you may have already answered this particular uh, point that I'm bringing up, Dr. Miles, and that is how many different quilting traditions are there uh, in the world of African Americans? And let me ask this other question: do you find then that there is a more folksy kind of quilting as opposed to a more refined, and which one is the better?
Well, I wouldn't say, I think there is a more folksy one. I think it even is regional. There's a difference between the way, even in European societies, the Amish quilt differently than in the Midwest than they do on the East Coast from Pennsylvania.
Mhm.
My mother did both. I have other families. Her father took his old overall genes. He was a farmer, and her father, one of my colleagues in graduate school, made her, a tied quilt, which is, that's another method. So I think it depends on what you've been taught. Sometimes the geographic area, the economic area. One of the things my mother got more sophisticated was she's a mathematician and she loved geometry and she loved triangles. I hated them because, if she could see the pattern with the colors and the triangles, I can't get there. I like squares and rectangles and simple triangles. But my mother, she loved those complicated patterns. And I think I wouldn't say that a folksy quilt is better than a more, as that other word you used, I don't forget it. Again, to me, it goes back to intent and why you're doing it. What is inspiring you to do it? One of the things I learned is that, for me, the best quilt was the imperfect quilt.
Mhm.
It wasn't perfectly squared.
Mhm.
All the stitches weren't perfectly spaced, which is the value that these big time folks try to do. Those weren't the best quilts
Yeah.
for me. That's
Mhm.
for me now.
Okay, well, we have one more, I think we have a few more minutes. I do want to pose this question to Ms. Coleman. Margaret Abel is asking, do you know of an authentic source for African print fabric? I normally find the Dutch waxed fabric or mud cloth. Um,
Well, I think the French Connection that you reference is a great um, source. And if in Greensboro, there are a couple of places in Greensboro on Gate City Boulevard near Tate Street.
Yeah.
I think it's called Nike. They have fabric there. Yes.
okay, okay.
But the mud cloth is at French Connection.
And Margaret, if you're not local to Greensboro, they do have a website. We placed it in the chat earlier. Jade, if you can put it in there again, that would be awesome. And they're one of the sponsors for tonight's event.
Yes.
See, Brenna, do we have any more questions? Let's get one more question in. It's 7:26.
I'm not sure of any more questions. Well, let's see. But Harvey Long did make a nice comment that I kind of wanted to announce.
Okay.
Okay. He says, I wonder if Walker is also suggesting that African Americans not be ashamed of a history or cultural practices linked to slavery. Dee longed for a connection to Africa. She changes her name, etc. I'm also thinking of Hatman's Lose Your Mother here.
Okay.
Other than that, I don't think we have any more questions.
Okay. Well, I wanna thank everyone, the panelists and the attendees. We have people all the way from Liverpool, England. That's Susie.
Wow.
So the audience is broad, and we've gotten a lot of wonderful feedback. Okay, Margaret says, please do place in the chat. Okay, so we'll take care of that for you. Like I said earlier at the beginning, this is the kickoff to an event that is going to lead up into a quilting exhibit, a mini exhibit because of COVID. So we will be filming a small documentary about quilting here in Greensboro. We're working with a young student here at A&T from the Mass Communication Department. So, go to sankofasewing.com to keep up with what we're doing. Ms. Coleman, oh gosh, I'm so excited about this part. In May, we're going to have a quilting class for youth ages 9 to 17. That's what I was talking about earlier with the Stitching Studio. And so we are collecting funds sewing machines, sewing notions, all of those things. So if you want to make a donation, that information is in the chat box as well. But we're going to have a 2-part class for children who sign up. So the registration is coming out shortly. And if you have a child and you're in Greensboro, go to St. Sewing and keep up with us. I just want to say thank you. And I look forward to working with all of you again. And thank you to the panelists. I pray one day we can all meet in person after behind COVID-19. And I wish you all health and peace. So have a good evening and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I did
Yes.
too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Be safe.
Good night.
Night.